start with the next speaker, and he can introduce himself.
Nice. Hello. I feel compelled to say something like, how about that React, huh? I don't know, is that what people do? Anyway, hi. Tell me if you've seen this one before. You get a screenshot by your PO with the mad paint skills that says, can we make this smaller? First question I'm asking, can we make what smaller? Is that the text or the spacing or the image? I don't know. And I should know because I just made this an hour ago, but I think I meant the text, not an actual screenshot. But yes, close enough to the ones I'm getting sometimes. And right, there's so many questions you can ask there. It's like, can we make this a bit smaller? Like, what does it mean, the numbers? What do they mean? It's like, was it big and we need to make it small? Was it okay and we just need to make it smaller? Is there a reason? Like, why the heck do we need to make it smaller? Does it need to fit with something else on the page? And if it does, why am I only seeing this section of the page? Where's the rest of it? And, you know, ultimately, how am I going to remember? Like, okay, maybe I see it, I'm like, yeah, smaller, 6 pixels. And then like 6 months later, it's like, 6 pixels, what does it mean? Yeah. My name is Fotis, that thing is my surname. The title of this talk is Minimal Static Styles as an API. Let's get started. Here's the situation. I've been working on this team at Futurize for 1.5 years. We have 2 sites in maintenance, which is to say that we add things to them occasionally, but we mostly just hope they keep working. And yes, we do have tests, actually. And we're actually launching a new site, or we launched a new site some months ago at this point. And we thought, okay, we're making a new thing. We get to start anew, clean the old code, exercise the demons, like, you know, try something new. And in particular for me, when I joined, I was like, hey, I just joined. How do I add this space? How do I make this thing smaller? To which the answer was, use the spacing Mixin. It takes any float, so you can be flexible about the spacing. So I was like, okay. I think it was like add include padding, parentheses. I put 2. Let's see what happens. 16 pixels. Okay, so I guess it's a multiplier. I put 1, 8 pixels, good. I put 3, would it be 16, would it be 32? It was 24 pixels. I was expecting it to be 32, but no. Then I was like, well, okay, that's interesting, let me try 1.5. You know what happened. 12 pixels. Yeah, so the spacing Mixin is there all right, but it's just a fancy multiplication function of 8, and if you can put any float, then it can give you, any number you like. So, And you can say that, yeah, this is the sort of thing that obviously you should catch in code review, right? Like it says, hey, you used 1.4 for the spacing Mixin. Don't do that. But we have all agreed on our team that this is extremely draining. I don't know about you, but like this brings absolutely no fulfillment to my life, having to go into PR review and say, yeah, you used 1.5 for the spacing, when, floats are not possible. Yeah, you can put the floats, but I mean, they're not possible. Really? And I like that one of the things that we've agreed with the team is like, yeah, okay, this is not contributing to our life in any meaningful way. Let's do better. And I think fundamentally this has to do a lot with how we treat the styles in our system, right? We tend to rely, due to the nature of our tools, on names. So for instance, if you need to like style something in CSS, it's typically a good idea to give it a class name. Yeah, you can use tags if you're doing something that you know. But typically you'll be using names, and I don't know about you, but like data table plus player card profile does not compute. It could do anything as far as I'm concerned. And even when you end up doing that, right, there's some values in your system. There's like, the paddings, the spacings are there, the colors, all of those things that you've been, implementing in all over these files. The designers have put a shit-ton of effort into like making sure they're consistent and they work well. The user is accustomed to those things and so on. But if we keep invoking things just by name, or, well, we were doing that in the old websites, and you quickly lose track. Because you're not seeing these values, you're just seeing like those names as something that's just bundled, like here's the data table. So that's the question I tend to ask these days, and that's the question that we were asking when we're making this thing, is like, what are the values in our system, right? Like, if you were to look at your system and say, yeah, these are the important styling values that exist in my system, this is a question an answer I get very often. It's like the aggregate of those that appear in it, which I don't know about you, but that seems very cyclical to me, because it's like, yeah, of course the values in your system are all those values that are in your system, but does that actually help you get anything fruitful out of it? And I think the key question to ask then is that, could those values possibly be finite then? Like, if you tell me, oh, the aggregate of those values that are in my system, and you were to spend like 5 days to clean them up and find them, would they be finite? They would be, yes. But, damn. Okay, let's fix this. Pop, pop, boop, boop. Yes. Okay, right. So people often call these scales or pallets. I call them scales because I like the idea of like moving up or down, like kind of like music, or you can try to do maths with them. But I also think palette is a really nice analogy, because of course you think palette is colors, but like, hey, here's a palette of spacings, you know? Like, how nice is that? Or here's a palette over typography, and like typography is 90% of your web page anyway. So I think this is the key insight, right? At the end of the day, these things do exist, whether explicitly or implicitly. So it's just a question for me of making those explicit, and not only making those explicit, but making those very visible to people in your project. If I've just joined and I can see this quickly, congratulations, like you have an extra gardener for your CSS, because I know what the values we're keeping are. I'm also still like the designer working on your project would be very happy. So to take that idea a bit to its logical extreme is like, okay, if we're working in React, which we are in our project, can you take those like scales and use them directly as props? Can you actually take a thing that is informed by this declaration of values and will tie them into props? Yes, turns out you can. You can represent that as a JSON object. So here's how you make a card. Yeah, as the text says, this is totally not how cards work, but you get the point. If I can scroll down. Yeah, so eventually you end up like with these things. You define them in another file. You could just say, okay, this is a box, and it can take padding, it can take borders, widths. Like, how many things do you need to change about a thing? Like, have you ever changed, I don't know, like on hover? Have you ever, I don't know, changed? Well, border you would change. I don't know. Have you ever changed the width of something on hover? Is that something that you should care about necessarily? Image, source, paragraphs. You can call this whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. And the components, it's similarly like you're importing these various like levers that you can pull to tune your component, and then you just say that a box can be styled with these things, an image can be styled with those things. I was not the only person to think about this. In fact, this is not what we have in production, so you're thinking, wait, what? But I'll get to that part. So this is StyleSystem by Brent Jackson. It's got a sit on stars on GitHub. It's a really cool library in that it recognizes this same thing, right? That the values in your system are what's important, so you might as well have them up front. Like in this case, they just a JSON object. And it ties in with CSS and JS libraries to generate CSS on the fly. Which is fine, I don't mind that. But is it more that dynamic that we need to? So in particular, when I was thinking about it, I was like, yeah, this is a cool idea. I work in a team. I would not really be able to say, hey, let's go in and use CSS and JS on this website, because eventually we have to backport these things to the other two websites that we're doing, and maybe don't change your entire styling pipeline if you can afford to. And I could have spent a day arguing, but we're in a team, and I'd rather spend a day making something that makes life easier for all of us. So all of us being the ones on the team, I don't know about you, but if your life is saint, let me know. So this is kind of what StyleSystem does in a way. It has this idea that you know the values, and yet you have a dynamic runtime because you're using CSS and JS ad hoc to generate these styles. This really professional diagram says that you have the values kind of as JSON that inform this like JS mixer or blender or glue library. You expose these as props kind of, so you can bind these. And then this part you defer to CSS and JS, and you say, okay, like these properties are going to translate to these things. But the title of this talk is static, so here's the static bit. It's just the same issue, basically, but sliced a different way. And the thing that I wanted to try is like, okay, can we actually keep those values in CSS? Can we keep the classes in static CSS and still get this really nice API? Turns out you can. So you have the values. I'm actually lying. I don't keep them as a JSON, not right now, maybe in a month. You use them to inform and kind of generate atomic CSS. I'll elaborate on that in a second. Then you need some sort of like thing in between, right, that allows you to say this class name corresponds to this like style value, this prop, because otherwise, what are you doing? And similarly, you have a JS thing that's probably a bit smaller in code size to bind the props. But ultimately, I just call it like glorified property access, because that's what it does. And you might think, like, as a thought experiment, what kind of CSS would I have to use to make this work, right? Because if my CSS is this thing here, if my CSS is like section title and it sets the font size, the line height, the color, and the font weight, which you might write very often in a BEM style, and then I want to change the font size, I can't really do that because there's the things all bundled up in that one thing, but then I want to change only that specific thing, and it's, it doesn't work, unfortunately. Also, unfortunately, my thing doesn't show up, so that's very interesting. Rerun. Let's see. Great. Anyhow, there's a couple of ways of doing it. So you could write it bundled up like that, but you could also write it in this unwrapped style, where you have one class name for one property. This is called atomic CSS. It's existed for a while. It's more like a technique than a specific framework necessarily. It looks something like this. So yeah, the first one is a bit easier to write, and the second one is a bit like, what the hell do all these things mean? But we'll get to that in a second. But the point being, if you want to expose granularly a prop to like a style, then that's how you would do it, unless you want to use like inline styles or something. But maybe don't. So, what's happening with my cursor? Come back. Yes, cool. Now my clicker is not working. Let's find out. Whoop, whoop. The hunt for the cursor continues. Yes, cool. Okay. Yeah, there's plenty of like actual frameworks, if you call them that. They're more like decomposed CSS, like Tachyons, Tailwind, Base CSS, that allows you to do that. Because it's not just the values in your system that are like, bounded, right? Like display property has 8 possible values, and those are the values that it can take. So you could enumerate those as well if you wanted to. Talking about this sort of style map, in a way, you'll see that we're using Sass, because again, the existing websites use Sass, so it doesn't make any sense for us to change completely and then try to backport the whole thing. But whereas you represent the spacing as a Sass map there, you can represent the map of styles to classes, again, as a plain JS object. So you say, okay, for the margin, 0 is MA0, for 1, it's MA1. Very tedious to write, but you can generate it, so, again, the stack is what I call glorified property access, because that's what it is. You just take a prop and you map it to a class name that stays out of it, that the classes stay out of each other's way. And it's also a layered API, and that's actually something that happened a bit accidentally, and I really enjoy, is that you have these very transparent layers in how these styles work. So you have the values, which is, again, the spacing, the line heights, and so on. You have mixins on top, again, because we're planning to backport that to the existing website, so it's actually quite nice to try and use mixins there. You have the atomic CSS on top, which you generally wouldn't write yourself, but you could. Or you wouldn't like develop with it yourself, but if you wanted to, you could. You have the style map, as I said. You have the style props on top, and you also get types, because I mean it's plain JavaScript objects, so you just like the types are just the index access. I'll show you how that works in a second. But the cool thing is that it's a sort of layered API, and it allows you to. It mirrors two things. It mirrors how you would go about using this in the old websites, because you would probably try to use the more basic things instead of the very heavyweight things like the style props. But it also kind of is the inverse of how you would learn about it, because if I've just joined the project and I'm like, okay, what is the spacing? I get autocomplete with types about what the spacing is. And if I put spacing 8, it will tell me 8 is not a space, sorry, I've got 6. If I put color red, it will tell me, sorry, like which of the 5 reds did you mean? And similarly, like the style props allow you to compose and author and so on. And if you're in the browser, like you at least see classes that make sense, or that you're getting used to these atomic classes, and you can debug in the browser, you can develop in the browser. One of my teammates, he really likes to develop in the browser, so he's really digging the atomic CSS actually, even though initially he was pretty averse to that. Demo, question mark? Let's find out. Yes, okay, I'm just gonna run you quickly through the different layers, and then if you want something more in depth, find me afterwards, because we're short on time. This is typically what the Sass file looks like. Again, I try to put nice comments, make sure that people know what's happening. At the end of the day, those Sass files is where our styles live, so we're paying attention to them in a way. Where is my cursor? Time. Come on. No, on the left. Great. Can you see my cursor? Ah, it's there. Ah, found the cursor. Yes, okay. So it tells you what the mixins are. You even have comments about what the type scale means, because we might as well add them. Got comments about common use cases. So this is a type scale. It's just a map. This is a nice mixin in a sense, because we have these mixins that tell you, hey, you're in SAS, but we're not going to let you hanging and tell you, whoops, looks like the font size you've been using for like a month is not valid and it had the default size. It just tells you, hey, I don't have a step of 6, I have a step of 5 if you want, I can give you that. And it's this idea, right, that you try to make every part of that layer or every layer in that stack friendly to people. You need to expose these values to people. Like if you don't expose these values to people, the moment you're gone, this thing collapses. And that's not very interesting. And the moment more people join the team, there's nothing worse than joining a project and feeling this sense of helplessness. And like I feel helpless very often with CSS. So it was very important to me that I can at least give warning messages to people when they don't use the values that exist. And again, you generate the atomic classes. Again, you can write this by hand. You can probably generate more of this. I wrote this by hand mostly because I was doing it step by step because I wasn't even sure if this was a good idea. So, before you go writing a very general generator, you could just write it by hand and see what happens. Then you have the style maps. Again, this file is like as dumb as you would think it is. It's literally just objects that expose the property values to the class names. Just generate this. Like you could write this by hand, of course, but you can also generate this. Actually, I do annotate some parts of it manually, in particular the comments in the type scale, but I don't know where that is. And here is the implementation, which is like 20 lines of code, because again, it's glorified property access. You take a thing, you look it up in the other object, you resolve to a class, you concatenate the classes, and voila, you have your styles. Again, if you're more interested in that part, find me afterwards. I don't find this particularly exciting myself. And then you have the components on top. So if you recall what it looked like in StyleSystem, for example, here this is the styling API. You will notice there's no runtime call. This is actually TypeScript, and it's just a type. You don't even need some representation at runtime that tells you you can't use this value because you have a compiler. The compiler is going to tell you, don't change the, I don't know, font weight on a link element or something. So you define that, and you import all the helpers, sort of. And then you just say, here's a box. We just call this super styled. I also opted for static styled. But you tell it what the style props are. You tell it what the valid HTML attributes are, because like at the end of the day, it is a div, and it should take any attributes that a div should take, and you just say div. So essentially, the only thing that's runtime bound is this thing. And then all of this is just statically type-checked. And you can sort of see it. You can do other things as well. I've created bindings for storybook knobs, so you can actually play with this at runtime, and hopefully we will be able to do that in a second. But just to show you real quick the autocomplete, for instance, if you have like a padding, and you go in and you say, oh, okay, well, that failed. Great. That's what I'd like to see. Margin bottom, maybe? TypeScript, why do you hate me today? Okay, let's figure that out later. But we can see it at runtime, actually, maybe. Here, yes, here is, maybe. Zoom out a bit, yes. So this is sort of our storybook. It's not very well maintained at the moment because I got lazy last month. But yeah, so we have these various sandboxes. Every component kind of has a sandbox that allows you to see all of the different properties interactively. So in this case, you can see everything that is exposed on a box. So for instance, you can go in and say, where's the padding? Padding. Nope. Next. Yeah, you can increase the padding. You can do whatever you want. There's again, all of these properties in CSS are known ahead of time that they have X variations. So you can enumerate those too. And of course, there's the things that you yourself have made. So for instance, if we go with color, does anybody see BG color? Yeah, let's go with that. Those are specific to our application, right? We just have whatever colors for our application. You can do other cool things with them. Since you do technically have access to these at runtime, you can take all your colors and generate all the accessible combinations for them, for instance. That's something quite nice. I haven't found a good way to also type check that. That would be really cool. But I mean, at the moment, you just have them at random. So it's like, hey, this many colors is not enough. It's like, there's a million colors there. There's enough colors to make your site accessible with. And you can do other funny things. Like we have this like math with padding, which is basically to show people how our spacing scale works, because it goes in powers of 2, so it's 8, 16, 32, 64, and so on. And the cool thing about that is that it means that when you have things stacked on top of each other, the math between them turns out to be quite nice. Yes, more or less that. Slides? Yes. Cool. No. Now? Yes. So this is kind of where it works for us. First of all, the implementation is tiny. It's 50 lines of code. Just by the description I gave you, you could probably implement this. And I love that. Like, I really like having somebody join the project and say, yeah, look at the code. It's 50 lines. You'll be able to do it. You can do it. The CSS output is really small. So our website right now is 16K. Because CSS, like our atomic CSS, it shares so much of the structure, and it gzips quite well. And I think the most important part is that these transparent layers really kind of mirror the learning experience, right? That there are these values that you're always exposed to, and you're exposed to these values through different ways that match the state of mind you're in. If you're in the browser, if you're authoring, if you've just joined and you want to find where the values are, if you're going to play around in the storybook. Onboarding new members on the team has been great. We've onboarded 3 people on the team since we started that, and they're not here, so could be bullshitting you for all you care, but trust me that they liked it. And I think another important bit is like you're cultivating these shared language, and I think cultivating is really the name of the game here, because nobody's gonna care about our pretty scales if they don't know they exist, or if they know that, oh yeah, Fotis is in the corner and he's the master of the scales, and like that's not gonna happen, And while the PO doesn't say, let's make this padding 3 yet. Let's see how long it takes to do that. What does happen is that he doesn't need to ask me, or if he asked me, I would ask him all those questions. But if he asks anybody now, you'll say, okay, this is a 3, we'll make it a 2. It's like, oh, that's too small, Maybe you try it. But then at least it's a key insight that, wait a second, if our spacing scale doesn't fit the thing, either the spacing scale is wrong, which is very unlikely because this has been, we've been doing that for a year, or it means that there is some other concern, right? Maybe there is a logo, or in that particular page, that is the problem. There is a logo on the left that's not in the screenshot that does not align correctly. And then that's fine. You can give it a class name. You can say pixel 6. And at least you know that the 90% use case is common and looks the same, and it is the same. And the 10% use case where you actually go and pixel tweak is very obvious to you. So you know that when you come back to this thing, that there is something special about this value. That's why it's there. There are alternatives to this. Again, StyleSystem is an alternative. You could literally take and run with it. I would love, if I was using CSS and JS, I would be using StyleSystem almost without question. But I think the main question is, again, where do these values lie? Do they lie in aggregate? If you were to gather all the values, you'd have them. And dynamically, are they declared up front, in our case? In our case, you can take the static CSS, drop it in another site, and start developing just with the class names. Or do they exist in aggregate, but you extract them statically, which you would do with some kind of compiler, so CSS blocks does it, and DSS does that. So I would be curious to see something built with those technologies, with this API. I think all of these are valid in a way. It really kind of depends on what you're doing, what your team is doing. There's no point chasing up some dream of perfection if your team is miserable. That would be my summary as well. It's what are the values in your system? How does a newcomer find those values? That's really important in maintaining this longevity of the system. I think increasing exposure to those values increases the ownership that people take in the code. And similarly, well, the combinations of these styles are innumerable actually, but many. The atoms are often static, so do you need to make the atoms dynamic as well? I'm not necessarily sure about that. And these ideas, right, the mix of these, how do you make a newcomer feel welcome, and how do you make sure that this thing is maintained, and how do you make sure that you have enough styles to make interesting pages with, they actually mesh quite well, and that's what I really liked about this project. Thanks, credits, inspiration. These three folks have, especially Adam Morse, the author of Tachyons and of the CSS, has a lot of writing on these things. Brent Jackson with StyleSystem. Matthew Griffith has done some really cool, interesting things in Elm, actually. So you have even heavier types there, and that's really interesting to explore. My name's been Fotis. Thank you very much. Questions?
What's the biggest amount of class names you have in your project for a div at the moment?
I guess 8 would be it. The thing is that we still rely a lot on like the cascade, for instance. So we really don't care if like something above has things that you inherit down below. So it tends to be that like the background color, for instance, is not on every single thing. It's just on the parent. So you typically end up with a lot of properties if you're doing, the thing I didn't show you is the responsive styles, which is really interesting, but I don't have time for. So if you're declaring the flexbox layout, then you've got a lot of things there, but usually 8 is the maximum. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk, and it's pretty interesting, and I've been aware of some of these libraries, Tachyons and Tailwinds, and I've been adopting, sometimes they're called prototyping classes, I've been kind of adopting in my workflow as well, because they're very readable, and I know sometimes there's a process to create further abstraction, but to me, they seem like they're well suited for developers that understand CSS well and the visual translation. What about people who are working on the team that may not be as adept to that? Do you feel like this mixing of these styles with, I'll call like Emmet, CSS style, shorthand class names, does it create confusion? Like how do you control staying on brand? Like how do you control people not just setting the font sizes and colors arbitrarily?
Yeah. So let me find the example. What's the layered API? Yeah. So actually, interesting bit we were saying about CSS, because 3 years ago I was horrified of CSS, and using Tachyons was what taught me CSS actually, because you get exposed to the properties very granularly, and I love that. So yeah, there is like a bit of a duality there, right? That initially it's quite inscrutable. Like, yeah, what does F1 mean? Fuck if I know. That's F. But that's the thing that I set out specifically to address here. It's like, I love Atomic CSS. I can go in the browser and start working with it, but we shouldn't need to, right? Like, I think the style props is the main thing you get exposed to, because we have all of our components are like what we call like super style components. So the first instinct, or all the code you read, for instance, if you jump in a code base and there's barely any class names, you know that, hey, so what's up with the styling here? And that's been the experience sort of. We also, when we do use a class name, we actually call it extra class name. So these components don't take class names. They tell you type error, did you mean extra class name? So you know that when you see it in the code, something is up and you should check the CSS. Yeah, I haven't had much issue, like apart from like the first couple of pairings, because I would never like start working with a new person just by code reviewing, right? I would always pair with them personally, or try some other way of like, you know, working with a whole team on a feature, for instance. And yeah, and usually they are pretty into that. We had the summer worker, Jonas, who was saying that I saw him the Atomic CSS, I think about a month, and he's like, oh, that's the thing that you can use directly. So it really is a question of how much effort you put into making all of the other things durable. So like the mixins, they give you warnings and so on. I would also be very wary of just doing Atomic CSS plain in the project, especially when this is such a lightweight thing on top. Yeah. Nice.
Okay, so I heard there is a sauna, and then we have some drinks. Actually, it seems like we have a lot of drinks to drink.